Hi, I'm Reverend Wendy Craig-Purcell here at the Unity Center in San Diego. Thank you so much for watching today. If you'd like to support the work that we do here, please consider making a contribution. Go to our website. It's easy to do. Thank you in advance for that contribution.
Like that. Do you ever feel like you got it all figured out, and just when you have it all figured out, something happens, and you realize you don't have it all figured out? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. I think every mother and perhaps every father knows that. Think back to raising your child. Think back to, yeah, I know. Think back to when you just finally got the sleep pattern when they were babies. You thought, finally I can get some sleep. And then they do what? They change. Everything changes. And it goes on like that through their growing up. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, and now you can sigh and exhale, what happens? Something changes again. Something changes again. Which really speaks to the importance of the topic that I want to share with you this morning. And that is the idea of always being a student. That should be a guiding principle in our lives. That we are always a student. That we approach our life in terms of lifelong learning. We've been exploring together some guiding principles that I have adapted and borrowed from Haas Business School at UC Berkeley. We took a look at the idea of questioning the status quo in our life and how so much really of our spiritual growth and our spiritual work is about that very thing. That we look at those times in our lives individually or collectively as a society when we can recognize something's not right here. And rather than just continuing with the status quo, we step forward with courage to a bigger, bolder, new idea to live our lives from or to help bring about change in our world. Last week, we talked about the importance of being able to walk through our life with a sense of confidence, a belief in ourselves built upon our growing capacities, but to do that with an attitude of humility. And today I want to talk to you about the guiding principle of being a student at all times. I've got to believe that anybody who finds their way into the unity philosophy, the unity teaching, or the science of mind teaching is already interested in and committed to being a lifelong learner. Because our teaching is not something we just get up here and then recite. It is actually something we live from on an active daily basis in our lives. Not just when it's easy to practice, right? But even when it is challenging and most difficult to practice. To be a student always. Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of our Unity movement, one of the things that he held near and dear was this idea that as a movement, as a teaching, Unity should remain open at the top. Meaning that if new ideas were revealed and proven in the laboratory of life, that we should step into those new ideas and abandon any previous limited ideas or thoughts. I'm really grateful that he had that attitude and that approach. Contrast that to Christian Science and Mary Baker Eddy, who when she was alive did amazing work, but her whole teaching was grounded and locked into, she was the end-all and be-all in her teaching. And Christian Science, I think, has been suffering in terms of not being able to really move forward because of that, because it wasn't open at the top. It didn't allow for and encourage deep questioning, ongoing questioning that would allow for the evolution of the teaching and the practice. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said, if scientific analysis were conclusively to demonstrate certain claims in Buddhism to be false, then we must accept the findings of science. Built right into that is the idea of being open at the top, always being a student, always being willing to learn, even if we don't always like the subject being taught, and even if we don't always like the teacher through whom the lesson is being taught. I want to share with you 5 ideas this morning that to me are signs of being a good student. I'm going to share them with you and then I'll go into them a little bit more deeply. The first is being comfortable, being uncomfortable. The second is remaining curious about life. The third is paying attention. The fourth is investing in your growth. And the fifth is keeping your ego in check. Okay, so the first one, do you remember what I said it was? Good. Our short-term memory is still there. Comfortable with being uncomfortable. Say that with me. Comfortable with being uncomfortable. That is easier, I think, when we're very young. But it can be a little more difficult as we get older. We don't want to be uncomfortable anymore. We don't want to start at the beginning. We want to start where? At least in the middle, if not at the very top. We don't want to look awkward. We don't want to be at the very edge of our learning, at the very edge of our growing. I've told you this before. Years and years ago, my skating coach would say to me, "You haven't been falling enough, therefore I know you're playing it safe. I want to see you stretch. I want to see you push. I want to see you be a little comfortable being uncomfortable." Well, skating, you could hurt yourself doing that. But you still had to do it if you were going to improve, if you were going to stretch, if you were going to get better. Gail Sheehy said, "Growth demands a temporary surrender of security." Take that in for a moment. Growth demands a temporary surrender of security. Being comfortable, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable at times. I can't help but think of the really deep work that a small group of us in this church have been doing now since the beginning of this year, and it's called our White Allies work. I've called together a small group of people to explore with me how do we begin to dismantle racism, one conscious conversation at a time. What is race anyway? What does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be white? How do we get where we are in our country today, where we still haven't dealt with the very real issues of racism, not just on an individual level, but on a systemic level? And boy, as we, as a group of white people, have been sitting together for 2 and 3 hours once a month on Sunday, exploring and exposing ourselves to learning new information, new material, there have been many times that we've had to deal with our own level of discomfort. But out of dealing with that level of discomfort and the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to learn, we are growing and changing, and hopefully in some small way can begin to make some positive differences. We need to be willing, if we really are desiring of being the best that we can be individually, it does mean that we have got to be willing to put ourselves out there. And the minute we put ourselves out there to learn anything new, whether it is a new skill or a new body of knowledge and information, on the front end, there is going to be some discomfort because there's going to be so much more that we don't know and so much more that we don't know how to do that we're not going to look like we got it all together. Does that make sense? Yes? And so I challenge you to kind of think a little bit about when and where in your life are you actively putting yourself in a place where you have to deal with a little bit of discomfort because you're trying to stretch and learn something new and different. Second, do you remember what the second one was? The first is about getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. What was the second one about? Good. About being curious, remaining curious about life. Some of you in this room have been with me long enough to know that my husband John and I were committed to raising our children, Jonathan and Jennifer. They're now young adults, graduated from college. But we were committed to providing them an atmosphere and an education where they would remain curious, because I believe that that is such an important quality for every human being, to remain curious. And so one of the things we committed to doing, and it was no small task, was homeschooling them from kindergarten all the way through their senior year in high school. And I have to say that while it was a tremendous amount of work, and required a lot of juggling of our lives to be able to support that. And it's not right for every family. I'm not suggesting that. The motivating factor, though, of being able to help them remain curious about life and about people and about our world has remained intact. I believe that we need to support our children in remaining curious, in encouraging them to ask why, to ask how. How often do you ask yourself those questions? And not from the place of, why me? That why is not the why I'm talking about. That's the why of self-pity. But the why that says, why? Open-eyed curiosity. How? Some of you who know me well know that I'm not the best person to take into a museum, because I'll spend the whole day on the first floor just reading and learning and trying to understand and absorb everything I possibly can. I'm one of those crazy people that love to watch programs on how stuff is made. Anybody else fascinated about stuff like that? Stuff that I don't even use, maybe. But it fascinates me. And what I know is that curiosity spills over and finds expression in all areas of my life. I believe people who remain curious are people who are open. They're not afraid of engaging with someone or something that's very different than what is their normal. Knowing that out of that curiosity, there can come a gift. There can come an insight. So remaining curious about life. The third, do you remember what the third quality was? So we have comfortable with being uncomfortable, remaining curious. What was the third one? Paying attention. You guys are really good this morning. Maybe you always are, and I don't ask you enough questions. But paying attention. Paying attention. Looking around you. Noticing. Staying alert. I love this little story that I read many years ago. It was about a shipping company, this true story, about a shipping company who was hiring for a position for a radio operator. And there were many, many, many more applicants than there were openings. And all the applicants were sitting in the outer office waiting their turn to go in and be interviewed. And one applicant walks in, sits down in the waiting room like everybody else, and there's a bit of chatter and a bit of noise, and all of a sudden this single applicant gets up and walks through the door marked private, comes back out maybe 15, 20 minutes later wearing the biggest grin. One of the other candidates sitting in the waiting room was frustrated that the audacity of that man to walk right through the door marked private and say, "What's going on? We've been waiting here a lot longer than you have. Why did you go in?" He said, "Because I heard them tapping in Morse code. We are looking for candidates who are alert and always paying attention. If you are hearing this message, come through the door marked private." He got the job. He got the job. It's that kind of being alert to your life. To your life. If you really believe that there's no place where God is not, if you really believe that we live and move and have our being in this one presence and power called God, and within this presence and power, this energetic field called God, is all knowledge, all wisdom, everything we could possibly need in potential and idea form, then we would know that all we have to do is pay attention, and we will be guided in paths that are right and good for us. That's all that's required of us. Pay attention and then act upon what it is that you are told. Josh Billings' quote that I read to you earlier. "I have lived in this world just long enough to look carefully the second time into things that I am most certain of the first time." Pay attention. Say that with me. Pay attention. Pay attention. The fourth, do you remember the fourth one? No? Investing investing in your growth. Say that with me. Investing in your growth. We know how important it is today as parents, those of us who are parents, to save for our kids' college education, how essential that is in today's world. And many of us do the very best we can to make sure that we provide for that, and that is important. What is also important is that we invest in our own personal growth and education, that we invest the time and we invest the resources. There is always something more for us to learn, always something more for us more ways for us to grow. And this is true of us spiritually as well. To invest in our spiritual growth, whether it is buying books or taking classes, but to invest in our own ongoing growth and development. I like these quotes. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance. I absolutely believe, I firmly believe that every one of us pays for our life education one way or another. We either pay for it through schooling and paying attention in school and applying what we learn, or we pay for it through the school of hard knocks. Amen? We pay for our education. Maybe it's because I like to control as much of my life as I can. I know there's plenty I can't, but in those areas where I can exercise a sense of mastery and control, I want to do that. And I know that in determining what I'm going to invest my time in and where I'm going to invest my resources for my own growth is entirely up to me. Entirely up to me. And the same is true of you. It's been said if you really want to know what a person values, you need to look in only two places. Do you know what those two places are? Their calendar and their checkbook. And Rich, you and I probably still occasionally write checks. I understand that's a really outdated way of dealing with finances, but the point of view is the point is valid. That you can tell what a person truly values, because what we value we invest our time in and we invest our resources in. So looking at our calendars or our day planners, looking at our checkbooks or our bank statements or so forth, gives us a real important mirror of what we say matters to us. So invest in yourself. Put something aside, whether it's time or dollars, for your own continued growth and development. Does that make sense? That was a very lukewarm, okay. All right, moving on to the last one. Do you remember what the last one is? Yeah, keeping your ego in check. Breathe into that for a moment. Keeping your ego in check. Please do not do this to the person sitting next to you. See, that's what happens when I've been your minister for so long. Some of you really open up and tell me about some of the things in your life. So I know to warn you, don't do this. Don't do this to your spouse right now. That would not be a good thing. Keeping your ego in check. Keeping your ego in check. To me, some of that means giving up the need to always be right or look good. Oh man, if we can just drop that, how much more energy, psychic energy and emotional energy, and I think physical energy, we free up to do the important stuff. If we can just realize sometimes we're going to have a great batting score and sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're going to do very well and sometimes we're going to make an awful lot of mistakes. I was inspired by this story when my kids were in school, in college. I loved the opportunity to walk on campus. I think you could plot me on any campus anywhere in the world and I would have a wonderful experience just going into classes and sitting and learning and listening, just because I think there's so much in the world that I know I don't know, and I'd like to know a little bit more and experience a little bit more. Anyway, along with this idea of keeping your ego in check, I remember learning the story of I don't know if he still is the dean of the business school at Berkeley, but it was a beautiful demonstration of keeping one's ego in check no matter how successful you become at doing what you do. And one of the examples of the way he kept his ego in check was he was about to give a very important speech to a few thousand people, But before giving that speech to a few thousand people, he called together 120 freshman students and stood before them and said, I'm going to practice this talk that I'm going to give on a national stage. I'm going to practice this talk before you, and then when I'm done, I'd like you to give me your feedback. Tell me what you thought was good about the content or not good. Tell me what you thought was good about my presentation style or not. And he delivered that speech, and then he opened himself to the feedback from those 120 freshmen. What kind of impression do you think that left among those young adults? Do you think it was a positive impression? Yes, that here's someone that they would have to look at as being very successful, professionally successful in his career, yet not so full of himself that he was willing to say and stand before a young student body and say, here's what I'm going to do. Tell me if you can think of ways to make it better. What a powerful, and I'm sure he benefited from that experience as well. So keep your ego in check. As Winston Churchill said, I am always ready to learn, although I do not always like being taught. Be willing to always be ready to learn, even if you don't like who the teacher is or what's being taught. I want to close with a funny little quote and see if you get why this fits with the message. It's from Roger Anderson. Accept that some days you're the pigeon and some days you're the statue. Namaste.
Many people enjoy Reverend Wendy's talks and meditations and aren't able to attend the Unity Center in person. If you're part of our extended family from around the world and would like to help support the Unity Center, please go to our website or download our free app, which offers even more ways to connect with the Unity Center. Namaste.